Welcome, Nookster. In this community, we focus on connection, relaxation, and inspiration. When you snuggle into your nook every Sunday morning to read my email, you can invite in what you need that day. As often as I can, I will add in recorded conversations, like this one that you're about to enjoy, that will help with your writing process, whether you are on your first book or your 20th. We're joined today by Meredith Sue, who is an experienced teacher, unlike myself, and has coached many students on their writing journey. Thank you for joining the Nookster community today. Would you like to tell us more about what you focus on?
I've been writing stories since I was a little tiny girl, and so I've always written stories. I've published quite a few novels, a couple of books about writing, and I thought, Samantha, I would say first, I know you're going to be asking questions and we'll have a conversation, but I wanted to say some general things, because most of what I say, I hope, is pretty concrete and specific, things people could actually use. But I did want to say a couple of general things first, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Is that acceptable? Okay. All right. Well, the first one is that I consider, I'm just going to talk about novel writing, although I'm certainly also talking about other kinds of writing. But I've always felt that it's a conversation, that you are involved in responding to things you've read. Therefore, it seems to me terribly important that you read as much as you can. So anybody who comes to me, I remember years and years ago, a man showing up in my NYU class, and we did, a go round, who are you, what's up? And he said, oh, I want to write a novel. I've never read one, he said, but I think I'd like to write one. And it blew me away. And I actually said to him, why do you want to write a novel if you never read one? And he said something. He was a middle-aged, actually he was an older guy. But the truth to me is you're not, well, I actually believe this. You'll never write anything better than the best thing of that type that you ever read. So if what you want to do is write great literature, you really should be reading great literature, classics, things that are today winning Nobel Prizes. You should be reading Virginia Woolf and Toni Morrison, and a whole slew of people who are active now and write wonderfully. If, on the other hand, great literature is not where you're going, I mean, if what you really are interested in is fantastic storytelling in one of the genres, maybe you probably should be reading, as indeed most people do, a whole lot of that, a whole lot of, Dennis Lehane and Michael Connelly or Nora Roberts, if you want to know what it's like, what really gripping romance novels are like. So all I'm saying is that consider reading part of your job of writing a novel. And then after you've read a lot, you should go away from it, because one of the worst things you can do to yourself is be reading a terrific novel while you're trying to write something, and it just makes you feel terrible because yours is such a mess and the one you're reading is so good. So that's one thing. Read. I mean, that's simple-minded, but I truly believe it. And the second one is that be sure that you are finding something of value to you in the act of writing, in the process of writing, because particularly now in this day and age, there's no guarantee that there's going to be money in it. Some of you, and I hope people who listen to this will become bestsellers and make a fortune. It's not the best way to make money, and there's absolutely no guarantee right now that you're going to make a lot of money. I mean, so it seems important to me that there be something in the process of writing for you yourself, as well as the hope of someday being famous or rich or whatever. Whatever you're hoping for or imagining. And we're human beings. We do many things at once, so we can both have great ambitions and also go deeply into the act of writing and get satisfaction out of it. And the last one of these little generalities I want to say to you is that one of the most important things that it seems to me is to separate the process of writing from the product you write. There are a lot of reasons for this. One is that they simply are entirely different mindsets. The process of writing is about getting into what you're doing, entertaining yourself, going as long as you've got energy, and thinking nothing about criticism, not imagining your school teacher over your shoulder or an editor who's going to reject your novel. What you want to do in the process of writing is just be there, feel it, enjoy it, and go forward with as much energy as you can. Separate, and I will say it's probably equally important, is when you're preparing the product, and that could be preparing it for a class you're taking. That could be preparing it for a group a peer group of writers, or of course preparing it in hopes of getting an agent or an editor with an audience in mind. And so when you're looking at the product, it is an entirely different mindset. You are being critical. You're saying, oh my goodness, what on earth was I doing there? Or this is ridiculous, or any, whatever it is. And you also are thinking about audience. You're imagining, who is it listening, who's reading this? Who is it that I feel like I'm speaking to? But the main point is to do those things separately. Do them on different days, do them in the morning and the evening, but don't confuse them, because it will it'll stop up your ability to kind of breathe freely and write if you are focused on it as a product. And this is one of the things that I see probably more than anything in my students, that they are so eager to succeed and so eager to make a career or to finish whatever their objective in that area is, that they lose the playfulness, the excitement, the thrill of just being in the process of writing. And those are my generalities. And so feel free to get more specific now, Samantha.
No, those are really great. I love those thoughts. They they're so true. I mean, even like as an editor, I love reading obviously as often as possible, and it's great just to see how other people are editing a sentence. And but it's true, at some point you have to put it down and focus on what you're doing, because I find too it can also influence you, and sometimes not in the best way. So that makes total sense with writing. I mean, you don't want to be focused on someone else's novel when you're trying to write yours, because you want your voice to shine through.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I actually, when I'm drafting, often stay away from novels and read, nonfiction or poetry. Poetry is a good way to kind of get your ear and your brain thinking in about style and words and that kind of thing. So that's one thing to do, is to read things that help you write rather than tell you how bad your writing is.
Oh, it's so true. It's like listening to music is a great way to show when someone asks, like, how do I show instead of tell when I'm writing? Music is always a great source for that, because you think about it. I mean, these artists write 3 minutes and you can picture it the whole time. So they've really mastered that art of showing versus telling.
Do you choose particular music? I mean, like music with no words, or music that fits what you're writing, or what's your thought about that?
I always choose music with words. Yeah, kind of just a vibe of the day, I guess. But yeah, I think it really does help you with that part of the writing, at least the writing process. So yeah, I was just thinking we would start with something that I see a lot of people talk about, and that's how to write a hook. I mean, everyone knows why a hook is so important, but like, how do you approach writing one?
The main thing for me, that I would say about hooks is I would never write it the first thing I write. In fact, I rarely write the beginning, the first thing that I write. I'm much more interested, if particularly in a long form like the novel, in finding the shape of the thing and getting many, many pages written in that process part that I was talking about. And a hook is, quintessential product. I mean, the hook is all about how do I get, you, the reader, to come in and you've picked up my book in a bookstore and now you're actually going to purchase it, or, something comparable to that online when you read the sample pages that they let you read free. So the main thing I would say is that I would never, I personally, and then really people do these things so differently, but I would never think about a hook until I had written a good portion of my novel. And at some point, when I began thinking about who's reading this, I wrote a couple of books for children. A number of years ago. I mostly write for adults, but the children's books were essentially first person stories that some kid is telling you. And so in that case, my hook was really just this kid kind of in your face saying, "Hi, I'm so and so, and this is what's going on with me." And so it's like in that case, that's probably not a classic mystery hook or something, but it is the way I approached it with writing for children. It was just like, you're meeting me, we're going to be friends or not, and I want you to hear what I've got to say. So for me, straight on, this is who I am is one kind of hook that I personally use sometimes. I'm not big on cleverness, or trickery or any kind of thing like that. Um, so I generally, this by the way, Samantha, is not my strong suit, hooks. But when I have actually got something drafted, and then I start thinking about the people who are going to be reading it, then I'll be coming up with something. And they're wonderful. I mean, they're wonderful. Also just read the beginnings of great books. Read Call Me Ishmael. I mean, what is it's like that's a really mysterious thing to say to start a book. Not that the book is so readable, but it's a big book, Moby Dick, and that's how it begins with three little words. This huge, long, elaborate book, but it catches you with that, and it's basically just. All right, I'm going to stop on that because, as I said, it's not my strong suit. Let's go on to clubs or spades or something that I have more of. Samantha.
No, that's no problem. I think you offered really valuable insight. I mean, you're right. It really does depend on your audience. And I think the most important thing comes down to remembering that humans are naturally very curious. So give them something to be curious about.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of thinking of it. I would also say that I frequently still, when I'm thinking about something vis-a-vis writing, particularly when I'm teaching, I turn to the internet all the time, and there are a million places to look up how to write a hook, and I'll do that too. I'll look things up. Not that I believe them, but if I read 5 descriptions of how to do something, it usually will get my brain going. So from my point of view, I do use the internet with questions about writing a lot, and they're almost always just a quick way of getting my juices flowing. But I would never in a million years take any one of them as the final word on anything. So if I really think my hooks are not doing well, I'll go online and look up some suggestions and then work it out for myself.
That's a good idea too. Well, okay, let's move on to something that comes up quite often too is how do you not lose your reader in the middle of the story? I mean, I think it has to do with some pacing, but how do you approach it when you're writing or when you're teaching?
Well, when I'm going to talk about it as a writer because the trouble with teaching novel writing is you rarely get the whole work in front of you. I mean, that's one of the great challenges of any kind of class or instruction that deals with whole books is that unlike a lyric poem or a short story or flash fiction, you never have the whole thing in front of you. You're always reading parts of it. I'm digressing, but my one of my 2 writers groups, I have 2 peer groups who critique one another's work, and one of them. We made a decision. We were going to read a whole draft. And it was like a breakthrough. Instead of bringing in 10 pages or 3 pages, we are giving ourselves much longer between meetings. So, it'll be 6 weeks or 2 months. And in that time, we will read an entire novel and then talk about it as a group we're able to talk about the arc of the story, if it has a great beginning and a great end, but if it's soft in the middle, which is really typical of novels. Now I'm coming back to your question. A novel that is not as good in the middle as it is the beginning and the end is very typical, and this is among published novels. I'm not sure there's any final answer to this, but the psychology of it is that as a writer, I'm so excited. I've got this thing I want to write, and I plunge in and I write 50 pages, 60 pages, and then something happens. I get tired. I have to go do something, and I lose the momentum. And at some point, I might pick up and keep going, but until I get to the end, and if I'm lucky, I'll come up with an ending. A lot of the middle will have been just me mucking around, trying to make my way, through this so I can get to the exciting conclusion. So psychologically, it seems to me it's not particularly surprising that the middle is soft in many stories. And there are a couple of ways of dealing with that. The main one is if you've got an entire draft, lay it aside for a long time. I mean, anything from 2 weeks to 2 months to a year, and then come back and read it very rapidly and see if you lose interest in the middle. Because if you lose interest with what you're writing, you may be very sure that a potential or actual reader is also going to lose interest. So, in that case, you're looking at yourself as a reader. And of course, all of that is none of that, I should say, is giving an answer to your question of what you do about it. So, but except that the one thing is to really identify it by pulling back and looking from a distance with the product head on, not the process head. Then one thing to do is to make an outline. I'm a great believer in outlining after you've got a draft or at least 100 pages. Talking about novels again, I don't consider outlining ahead of time very useful. I mean, I don't mean taking notes, about my 5 characters or my 2 cities or whatever, but to actually do a complicated, full outline before you start writing is generally, IMHO, a big mistake because you'll get into doing that instead of writing. So the time that I think is important to write may be when you're facing to write an outline is when you're facing that soft middle of the novel. And if you outline what you've written, not what you're going to write, what you've written, it may become clear to you. Again, you're not in that creative head. Not the process creative head. You're in the critiquer's head, and you'll see that someplace in the middle there's I'm going to make it a love story because that's easy for everybody to picture what it is. They go out for a meal and they have a fight, and then they go out for another meal and they have another fight, and then they go out for another meal and they have a fight, and that time they reconcile and go home and go to bed, and then the story goes on. And you could see, if you were looking at that in outline form, 3 meals, 3 fights, and they weren't even very good fights. How about if I just make one scene out of all that and get rid of the 40 pages and turn it into 10 really intense pages? And again, clearly this is not specific advice. It's just, a way to think about it. But if you can think about it as a sketch, as a schemata, you can sometimes see what's missing. You might say, "Oh, well, maybe she should have gone to work," and that subplot go on for a while. You begin to get a sense of how you've done all the same thing over and over again, and have perhaps left things out. The third one, which I'm particularly fond of, is working at the entire novel, but certainly the middle, via scenes rather than just writing straightforward. If you imagine, when you're thinking of your novel, what the best scenes are. One of my favorite exercises for myself or anyone else is in early stages. So sit down and write the 5 or 7 or 15 most important scenes that are going to happen, scenes that are going to be shown, not told. You're going to have people talking and acting and doing things, and you name them. You name those. I'll say 11 scenes, and instead of writing straight through, you write those scenes. And then later you come back and go straight through. So in other words, you're only writing the high points. And since it seems to me that middles, part of the problem is as one flails around for how to get from here to there, it's not the most intense high points. And again, I don't mean necessarily fights or stabbings or anything like that. I just mean moments that are important and intense. And if you can write just those, it may turn out you don't need much between them. And if you do need something between them, you can fill it in later. So those are that's 3 ways I would approach the middle. There may be more ways, but that's what was on my mind today.
I absolutely love that idea. I mean, it really.
Which one?
I mean, all of them. Like that last one, especially, it fixes the pacing question when people ask, "Oh, is my novel paced correctly?" I mean, if you're writing it by major scenes, then that there's space in between that you can kind of calm down your reader, because you don't want your reader going through high energy and high emotions the whole novel. They'll be exhausted. So,
right.
Yeah, that's a great idea, how to just fix your pacing without stressing about it.
Well, and that's a place that novel writers can really learn from screenwriters too, because they have these, for me, too elaborate ways of creating scenes. And the idea is always to up the ante, so that if in part 1 there's a kidnapping, in part 2 the main character is going to be threatened with kidnapping. In part 3, his daughter, it's always his daughter, is going to actually get kidnapped. So, like it's all kidnapping, but they go from like just, factual stuff to threat to him, to his actual child, at which point, he focuses on all of his old skills from when he was in the CIA, and he smashes the bad guys and saves his daughter. But the point that what they're so good about is pacing. I mean, they don't fool around with kind of wandering through material. They have to have pacing, which is not. It makes for a certain kind of movie, but there's something to be learned from. There's a lot to be learned from it.
I love that. That's genius. Yeah, I love that. And I really like your perspective too on separating the process and the product. I mean, it really reminds writers that they don't have to be so focused on their word count every day, or like, oh, I got to publish this book in 2 months' time. Like, sometimes you just need to take a step back and not be so focused on that date you've stuck in your head, and maybe more focus on making sure the story is where you want it to be before you publish it.
Yeah. Do you find a lot of writers getting caught up in things like word count or deadlines for contests or whatever?
I do. I see it a lot on social media. People are all like, oh, I've got to write 2,000 words today or 5,000 words today. And I feel like sometimes that might help, depending on who you are. I mean, it's always good to have a goal for the day, but other times I find that's going to hinder you, because did you write 5,000 good words, or did you just write 5,000 words to check that off your to-do list? And especially if you're self-publishing, you have more control over your release date. So sometimes you have to push it back, and I think that's perfectly okay. I would rather you push back your release date and we get a better book than you push it out just because you had that date in mind.
Yeah. Interesting. The numbers. This reminds me of another kind of outlining that I'm in favor of, which may also help with things like pacing. And this this desire to feel like you've accomplished something. This is something I use pretty much every day when I'm writing a new project, and I call it, this is just something to give it a name, a running outline, which means that it's not a plan that I'm going to work from, nor is it what I was describing before when I make a sketch of the whole novel in words, just to look at what it looks like, but rather I actually make a record every day when I finish my writing time of how many pages are in the chapter now, if any characters left or came back, like, so I'll get rid of, if it was 3 people and now it's only 2, I scratch out that name. I put all kinds of little bits of information that will help me when I go back and look at it. They give me a little sense of accomplishment. I've done this much. And I also use that when I realize this chapter, this section is getting a lot of scenes. It's now 23 pages long. Every other chapter, scene, whatever my book, however I've broken it up, is 10 pages. And so then I start looking at it and say, gee, maybe this needs to be broken up. And I break it up into 2 chapters. I may have to do some renumbering, but it's a day-by-day way of looking at what you've accomplished. So if you're the kind of type A person that likes a little, pat on your back, it's nice. You can see how many pages or words or whatever you count. And it also gives you a little place to make some notes about changes. I've changed the main character's name, so I have to, deal with that. And particularly, it lets you see if a chapter is twice as long as all the other chapters, which doesn't mean much, except that you probably should make it into 2 chapters. A chapter by definition is more or less what somebody reads before bedtime. It's roughly the length of a short story. It's a totally arbitrary division in novels, and that's been used, all these years. And I think it's convenient for the kind of thing I was describing just now, but it is not nearly as important as the scene, which we were talking about before. But anyway, that running outline can be a really handy way of giving yourself a little boost to how much I accomplished, and also seeing what's happening, what changes are coming, and what you might want to change. I'll say more about scene whenever you want me to.
Your insights are wonderful. I love how you approach this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking too, we can definitely talk about scene. I would love to hear more about what you have to say about that, and just storytelling in general. I was thinking about the expectation versus reality for your characters and what's going on. I always like to, I know I read a lot of romance books. That's more my thing, but I like to sometimes read romance books that don't have a happily ever after, just to kind of mix it up, because everyone seems to think it has to stick to a certain format or layout. And I do too. I like a balance of what I like to call fiction magic and reality. Fiction magic meaning in the books and the movies, everything's just all wrapped up in a neat little bow at the end, and you want your characters to be relatable. So how do you work on that? How do you make sure that the characters and the storyline is relatable?
Let me come back to relatable. I wanted to have you say a little bit more about the difference between fiction magic, and when you said reality, you mean like realism. You mean like the natural, that it should look like real people going through their lives. Is that what you mean?
Yes, exactly. Sometimes you read a story or you watch something and it's so simple that the character goes from point A to point B and the problems are solved quickly. And it's very hard to relate to a story like that because it's just not how life goes.
Right. And it's also, a very practical thing is, the movies have got people who are hired to do continuity. Their job is to make sure that everybody doesn't go swimming in the ocean in January. Or their job is to, I know it actually, I don't know her personally, but I know of a writer who did very well in her youth, and she was writing a new novel, and somebody got pregnant, and the pregnancy lasted 18 months. It was just a mistake. She just had too many. It was not fantasy. It wasn't science fiction. It was just she miss didn't figure out her dates. So one if what your work, the words I like to use the word verisimilitude, which means does it seem real? Because in fact this is not real. We're not this is fiction is always an illusion of something. If you were to write a dialogue by simply transcribing everything the two people who are talking say, it would be unreadable. I mean, it would be like a transcript from a courtroom. There'd be no gestures. There'd be no breaks. There'd be a lot of and it just would be unreadable. Now you can put a touch of those in to give people a sense of of it being real or having verisimilitude, but a novel conversation, a bit of dialogue, is going to be maybe a third the length of what it would, or even less of what it would have been in real life. So it's an illusion we're creating. It's going to be sharper and clearer than real life, but you're going to do all kinds of little things I hesitate to call tricks, but in order to make people feel it or relate to it, as you say, there have to be ways of making you feel you're hearing a conversation, even though it is in fact not naturalistic. That was one of the most striking things to me when I was really young, like a kid in high school trying to write little stories, which I thought were big stories. I would try to make it totally natural, and it just didn't work. I didn't have enough time to make it natural, and it wasn't very interesting to read. The relatable part, could you say a little more to me about what you mean by relatable? Because frankly I don't think about the audience until, as I've said before, until I'm going back and revising. So what do you mean by relatable in this case?
Yeah, I mean, the character has flaws, that the character kind of makes mistakes that we would in real life. I think the best thing a writer can do is think about, okay, if I was this character, what would I do? What would I say? Make it more human. Well, yeah, we
Gotcha.
can't
Yeah.
relate to characters that are perfect and have no problems. And so, yeah, I think
And
it's so important.
that's something that must come up a lot in romance writing, because it
Yeah.
is a kind of wish fulfillment that and which is I've only lately begun to read romance because I read an article that pointed out that romance writing has always been an area that was read by women, written by women, usually edited and agented by women, and it was like this world of women, and that was important in itself. And then I read a couple of romance novels, and I realized that except for the emphasis on the romance, they really are, the people have jobs, they have families, they have problems. It's regular people, but except that the storyline, the story arc, is about a romance, and that in itself, carries people through. And whether or not it has a happy ever after at the end or not is a different issue. And but mainly it's a realistic story that's held together by a probably not so realistic happy love affair that goes through vicissitudes and then turns good at the end. And I read a couple. I mean, I was pretty. I mean, I read my first Nora Roberts. I don't know how much more of hers I'll read, but it was the characters were anthropologists and archaeologists, and they were very concerned with their work. It was very interesting, and there was a situation of somebody discovering her birth family by chance, not because she went looking for her birth mother. She was adopted, and it had lots of good stuff. And I personally kind of skipped over all the kissing and going to bed and whatnot because I wanted to get on to the other parts. But and anyway, I'm not sure I made my point there. But I mean, what I do want to emphasize is that making it realistic is not the same as making it naturalistic, and that if you don't have flawed character, you may want your character, you may fall in love with your character, you may adore this person that you've written a story about, but you don't want to, and I'm just agreeing here with you, Samantha, you don't want to make it easy for her or him. I remember with my children's book, my son was about the age of the main character in the children's novel, and that's one of the reasons I was writing it, because I was thinking about kids and kids writing, and he got very mad halfway through the story. He was about in third grade, and he said, "Why does Marco have to live in a bad neighborhood?" He took it very personally that I had made this little main character live in a kind of rough and tough neighborhood. And I was struck by that. I think he was hoping for just a pure fantasy where everything good happened to this character that he liked. And but otherwise, why would you write without any without conflicts, both internal and external? There's no story really. There's maybe a love song or something, but there's not a story.
That's very true. Would you like to talk more about scenes?
Well, as I indicated, a really good way to actually organize a novel is by sketching out your scenes, rather than writing the whole story. Scenes are, in my opinion, what really make novels. The chapters, as I said before, are a convenience. They are not the heart of it. The heart of it is scene, largely because scene is the place where action, the story gets shown to us. This is show and tell. You need both show and tell to write a novel. I don't care to hear what happened during the boring 10 years before they got back together. I want to hear 10 years later they met again. I don't want it. So that's that kind of telling. You have to have it. But then when they get together, I don't want you to say, and then they met in Paris and pretty soon they went someplace else. I want to know, after 10 years, what was that first meeting in Paris like? I want to know what season it was, what the weather was, where were they? Were they overlooking the Seine? Were they, in the Louvre? Where were they? How had they changed? How did they look? What were they wearing? And of course, what did they say? Because if scene is the heart of the novel, as I think it is, dialogue is the heart of the scene, and everything. I have one of my favorite exercises, which I've done many times myself, is to take four boring sentences, like lines. So it goes, "Is this it? I guess it is. Well, okay." It's 3 lines. So it's just these 3 boring lines of dialogue. And what you then do is you build a scene around it. You put all those things I said, the who, what, when, where, and how they said it, and what somebody was thinking as they said it. So it's that bare bones speaking, human speech, where human people meet each other, and probably always will. I mean, even as highly digitalized as we are, it's like talking heads. It's like right now, the two of us are talking, and it's two faces and voices. So that's, if you can start with dialogues. Actually, many, many years ago, I was a student of Anthony Burgess, who wrote many, many novels, was most famous for one that was made into a movie called Clockwork Orange, which I just reread. It was better than I realized, than I remembered. But he said he always started a new novel, and I don't believe this, but this is what he said. He said he always wrote 60 pages, exactly 60 pages of just dialogue, simply as if it were a play, the lines the people said. Nothing about, none of the he said, she said, none of the setting, none of the things I was saying. And he said that was how he wrote a novel. And then he threw that away, and then he could start writing. The throwing away is what I don't believe. If you've written 60 pages of people talking, you're going to keep it or reuse it. But his point was that that's where it comes from. Human beings interacting with dialogue and conversation is one of the primary things we do. So it's dialogue, and it's the other parts around the dialogue that make the scene. It's where the drama happens in theater and movies. When there's when another person comes in, it's a new scene. When the way when things begin to change. And that's and so to master that, and to think in those terms, I think is really important. If you find yourself, in my little, stupid example I gave, 10 years have passed, the two people are now going to meet, you definitely want to show that. You can say 10 years passed, you can tell that, but I darn well want to see when they meet after 10 years. Does somebody get a scar? Has somebody's hair turned gray? I mean, what has happened?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And especially like how they feel in that moment, or even like what they're smelling, like all of it. You're going to want all of
All,
that.
all of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are, all those pieces of fiction writing go into a scene, and it's just the size of it, the center of it, the bones of the dialogue is what makes it work. And I'm kind of, a fanatic about that, but because I don't want to read, I don't want to be bored. I mean, I don't mind what you're writing, and I'll read almost anything, but I don't want to be bored. I learned that from children. I used to be a writer in the school, and they'll forgive you anything except being boring. So,
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Would you like to talk about, I know you have a really good perspective on revision, on how to approach, especially the ending of the book. Because, I mean, I've read some books that you get to the end and you're kind of disappointed with how the end happened. And you're thinking, okay, I wish they would have spent a little bit more time working on this part. And you do have a really good perspective on that. Would you like to share that?
well, I mean, endings are problematic in our present place and time. In the 19th century, and I'm a great fan of Victorian novels, Russian novels, all that 19th century stuff. They knew how to end it. You ended with a wedding. I mean, and it was so that people were satisfied. I mean, maybe it wasn't quite it wasn't that nobody died or nothing bad happened, but somebody would get married. And, we can't, that doesn't go anymore. Well, I guess it sort of goes in romance, that a couple will, at least seem to be temporarily staying together. But we don't have good endings. There was a time in the 1970s and 80s when a lot of people ended their novels with an explosion. Like if they couldn't think of anything else, they would just destroy everybody. And so, explosions certainly are endings. So, I mean, the problem is, what I'm trying to say is they're not. It's not easy to find the right ending, and I have a lot to say about revision. And once I do find an ending, um, it's often just a couple of people speaking. It's often these are kind of practical suggestions for a person who's having trouble with it. I have an exercise where anybody can do it. Some character is standing on a hill or on a balcony in a city, and they're looking out at the scene, and this is the end of the story, and they're having a few reflections about it. I mean, that's a kind of a soft ending in the sense that it's not an explosion, it's not a celebration, but it is some important character just kind of looking around and saying, well, there we are. There can be surprises, of course. The one thing I do know is that when I give readings from my work, I never read the ending. And I bet you could check this with people who read in public, and they rarely does anybody read the ending. The reason for that is, and particularly in novels, that it's not that the ending, it doesn't matter if the ending is clever, if it's an epilogue, if it's two people kissing, if it's somebody shooting somebody, doesn't matter. What matters is the huge weight of everything that came before. So the ending, to some extent, in novels, there's not a. I mean, I could come up with some formula for how to begin a novel, but I couldn't for an ending, because it only works if the entire novel worked and leads you there. And again, I would recommend people look at some endings of books and see how they do end. What I'd rather say a little bit about before we run out of time is revision, which is, based on what I said at the beginning about process and product. The second half is the revision half, and that is at least a half and maybe three quarters of the project of writing a novel. It goes on for a long, long time. Most of us have some sense of editorial revision, where you go. Some people think they're not any good at it, but where you go over sentence by sentence and select better words, or perhaps I hope cut. I mean, one of the most important things to do in revision is to cut. But to actually revise a novel, and this again takes us to the shape of the novel, the middle of the novel, the end of the novel. I have a couple of ideas that I like particularly. One is to revise just your final 50 pages, 30 pages, some what seems appropriate for yours. But often as we rush forward in our writing and in our excitement as we come to the end, and we certainly, we know what's going to happen, but the writing falls down often because we're in a hurry. We're almost to the end. Let's go, let's go, let's go. So a really good revision technique is to go back to, chapter 20 and revise chapter 20 through 25 and give it a really close look, including at the final page and the ending of the thing. So, and then after you've done that, go back to the beginning. The big mistake in revision is to always start at the beginning, because you're going to end up with a jewel like highly polished, gorgeous first 10 pages, and then and it also gets frozen. It becomes frozen like a jewel. It doesn't have energy, and then there's the rest of it. So that's one thing. I have a couple of other favorite revision techniques for a novel. One of them that I particularly like is hunting for in the word processor. Hunting for particular characters. So this works is most helpful for minor characters. So I take like the main character's mother-in-law, and every time I do a search for her, and I'm looking for the trajectory of her story. For one thing, does she change? I mean, maybe you don't want her to change. Maybe she's just jokingly awful, and she stays the same. But most characters in novels, I think, are more interesting if they have some change. And so, does she change? Does she get better? Or does she get worse? And as you're doing that, you also can check for housekeeping, like, do her eyes stay hazel, or do they suddenly become piercingly bright blue? And that's not a good thing. That's your continuity. You want to do that. But anyway, to follow just one character, hop, skip, and jump through the novel looking for that character, or the dog, or a bar that repeats, that shows up as a setting multiple times. Have you repeated the same details? Because one of the things about many writers we'll get too descriptive, that word descriptive, and they'll put too many details. But of course, what you can do with a recurring person or place is spread them out. As you go through looking at just Frank's bar, you can add a detail here, add the bathroom the second time it shows up, and the graffiti the third time, whatever, things like that. So I'm very fond of that particular exercise, and do it multiple times, looking for for changes that might happen. I have more, there are a lot of things like that, but the mainly revision is not correcting. I go back a lot to when I worked with children in teaching writing to children, because they thought a change was a sign they had failed, that it was bad because there was a change. But to me, when you go back and start changing, that's often when the most fun comes, because as you muck about and make changes, you may suddenly realize something you can't believe you forgot, some detail, some character who needs to make an appearance, perhaps in a memory or a dream. And if you get your mind set in the right way, that kind of revision can just open up the story again and give it another layer. And to me, the best novels, whether they're humorous or genre or whatever have more than one layer. They have some depth.
That is very true. And, you know, you can go through the grammar and everything. It always comes last. It's important to go through and make sure the details and the consistency and everything is there. And to especially revising to make sure that you've been descriptive, but you haven't lost your reader in the description.
Yeah, I think the one more thing I did want to say is that I think description in today, in this almost a quarter of the way into the 21st century, I think in many ways description is more useful to the writer than to the reader. There are a lot of things that readers in 1850 had never seen. Everybody had not seen a tiger. Everybody had not seen, I don't know, the ocean even, and things needed to be described. I mean, people make jokes that they were paid by the word, which was also true, but mainly people needed to know what things looked like. We don't need that as much. However, as a writer, there's nothing like overly elaborate description to make me see it and me feel it. And so the trick becomes I want to really, like figure it out, see it in the round, see the colors, see as you mentioned, the other senses, the smell, the touch. And then when I come back to revise, I try to discipline myself to get rid of everything but the most salient, the best details. So I find it highly useful. I often even get plot points when I'm describing. When I describe a lot, and I suddenly say, "Well, wait a second. Where did that hat come from? What if the hat was what he was shopping for the day that I mean, it's like anything that what you're really after is getting your mind going under and pulling up stuff, and description's great for that. But you do have to discipline yourself to cut 3/4 of it later.
Yeah, and I think it's especially important to make sure in the beginning you don't lose the reader in that description, because they're not invested yet in the story and in the characters. They got to get to that point, like you already are, to care enough about those details.
And then they may be willing to go with you on that. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, that's good advice.
Yes, I know you have to go soon, but I was just wondering, is there anything you would say about writing a blurb for your book? Do you have any approaches to that?
I mean, ideally, you don't. When you say blurb, do you mean the thing that goes on the back cover, or do you mean a way of? You actually mean the one that goes on the back cover? I mean, ideally, you get somebody else to blurb it for you. Yeah, that's the ideal, and it doesn't have to be somebody famous. I mean, you can get your greengrocer that buy your vegetables from to read a little bit and say something. They're very important, those blurbs, and one of my I have this is a little off topic, but a good exercise, I think, for the writer for thinking about the novel, but it could also be useful as a blurb, is actually to do the things that you're always told to do. One is to write yourself an elevator pitch for your novel, where you can do it in 25 words or less about my novel, and similarly you can write a blurb about your novel. I'm calling them exercises because I think it helps you if you do it lightly. If you don't say, "Now I'm writing the blurb," if you instead say, "This is something I want to play with." So a blurb, there's the elevator pitch, the blurb, and the third one that I'm very fond of, and out of which you can find a blurb for yourself, is to write a review of your book. As if it had, and the reviewer likes it. It's a short review. The reviewer thinks it's really good, but they have one suggestion for where it might have been better. So, by saying first the positive and then someplace it might have been better. And actually there's a fourth one to go back to the blurbs. And this is to imagine some writer that you admire, living or dead, what they would say about it. You don't have to use their name. I mean, it's your writing, but you could imagine what would I don't know what would Charles Dickens say about this, or Toni Morrison, or whoever you want to choose. Nora Roberts would probably say it needs a love story about mine. But that so again, it could be helpful to do it in a voice. That would be, I think, a useful thing to do, but mainly to do it playfully so you don't get hung up. I mean, a lot of the things that you're telling me people are asking on where are they asking? Instagram, TikTok, wherever. They are serious questions, but they indicate to me people who are nervous about the whole thing and scared and are not, in my opinion, sufficiently playful, because creativity can be about death, murder, child abuse, war, can be about anything, but there is always an element of play in it. I mean, does that sound awful? But it's like, it's like you are imagining, and the minute you're imagining, which is one of the great human attributes, you're playing like a child, in the sense of, which is of course their very serious work. So I would suggest about several of these things that people. I'm not going to. I hate the phrase "lighten up" because it's usually kind of an insult. Someone says, "Oh, lighten up," but I do think to be more playful about it might be helpful to people.
Yeah, so, not take yourself so seriously, I guess, is a good approach to it.
Right, because if you're a novel writer, you're not necessarily a good blurb writer. I mean, it's a different skill set.
Very true.
If you're writing novels, if you could write it in a haiku, you'd write a haiku,
Yes, that's very true. You're more the long story than the short story. Okay. Would you, so you offer coaching for students privately as well? I know you teach a NYU class, but
I don't usually coach. I do teach private classes, usually with a smaller group than NYU is willing to have classes for. So I like small groups. I also give a fair number of one-shot workshops, which are fun for me. I mean, I almost always include some personal feedback. So I mean, I know that's that's really what people want. They want somebody to read what they've written and give them something back. But so I often do like half-day workshops with with some feedback, and I do I'll do 5, 6, 10 session classes. Sometimes I do live workshops too around the country from time to time. But I do, and the best way, I guess, if anybody wants more of me, is to go to my website, which is a non-professional, made by me place where I put everything. And it's my name, meredithsuewillis.com.
Yes, I'll be including it in the description of the video as well. So anyone that's at that stage can definitely find you. Well, thank you very much for spending time here today with our Nookster community and answering all of my questions.
Thank you so much, and I enjoyed it. So they were good questions.